On today's show, we'll be talking about prophetic dreams, portals, spirits, and much more. All coming up on this episode of Paranormal Mysteries. Thank you for joining me, and welcome to another week of Paranormal Mysteries. I am your host, Nick Ryan. I hope that everyone had a great weekend, and before we start today's show, I'd like to say thank you to Gino, Evelyn, Bill, Lorraine, and Lauren for their support and generosity. If you enjoy the show, please remember to subscribe, share, and review the podcast. This supports us by helping new listeners to discover the show. And if you'd like to support us even further by becoming a patron or by donating, please visit us at patreon.com/paranormalmysteries or at buymeacoffee.com/paranormal. These links and others can be found in the show notes. And if you've encountered the paranormal and would like to share your story, please email me at paranormalmysteriespodcast@gmail.com. All experiences, no matter how big or small, are always welcome. And with that in mind, our first story of the night comes to us from Meg. And Meg says, "Hello, Nick. I love your podcast. I was looking for new ones to listen to, and my sister recommended you. I was hooked ever since episode 44, Possession, Shadow People, and Sleep Paralysis. I've always seen things. I've seen a hat man, like the one in your stories when I was very young, and I've had multiple accounts of paranormal activity. I'll share more stories later, if you would like. This one particular story is my favorite, mainly because it is one experience that made my mother realize that I didn't have an overactive imagination. Here's a little backstory before I get into the story. My mother lost her mother at age 6, so I never met her. I've never even seen a picture of her, as my mother was adopted into a new family, and all of her belongings never went with her. So I never even saw a photograph of her. It was my 14th birthday, and I was having a sleepover with 2 of my friends. We just got finished with the cake and ice cream, and decided to go up to my bedroom to play with all of my birthday gifts, and watch some movies. I got to rent signs for our sleepover. We all got into our pajamas, grabbed leftover pizza, and settled down to start the movie. We were just getting into it when I noticed the room get really cold. My first thought was, yes, it's an old house, and it was cold out, and that's probably the reason. I ignored it for a few minutes, and I had this feeling of being watched. I started to look around and noticed an older woman in the corner of my room, and she was facing the wall. I remember vividly what she looked like. Her hair was brown with red curlers in them. She wore a pink robe that had some red flowers on it, and she had brown house shoes. I got really scared and I didn't know who was in my room. She then turned around, and she had brown glasses. Her eyes were soft. My feelings of being scared vanished, and were replaced by feelings of love. I know it sounds weird, but I genuinely felt this love feeling, somewhat like peace. My friends turned to see what I was looking at, and they saw something pink, but that was it. But it freaked them out. We all ran downstairs to my mother and told her what we had seen. She looked at me, and she was pale. She asked me to repeat it to her. I thought she wasn't going to believe me, but she did. She sat me down and told me that that was what her mother looked like on the day that she died. My mother stood in shock for quite a bit, and having me go over and over every detail. She asked me how I felt, and I told her that I was scared at first, but then I felt loved. She started to cry due to remembering her past. My mom now knew I had a gift, and it wasn't my overactive imagination. I've only seen her once, and as the years have gone on, we've had discussions about how she may have wanted me to know her, and we still don't know. Thank you for taking the time to read this and put it on your podcast, and thanks for all the great stories. Meg. Our next story of the night comes to us from Melanie, and Melanie says, "Hi Nick, I hope you're doing well. I had some time and thought that I'd write you yet again about some more interesting experiences that I've had with the paranormal. I've always been able to see spirits since I was little, but now that I'm in my mid-20s, I have not seen anything in years, which I find interesting. As a child, I would mostly see spirits that were only a shadow, either white, gray, or black, but sometimes I would see details, and even more rarely, I would recognize someone that I once knew. These couple of occurrences come to mind. One day, I was catching up with a friend that I hadn't seen in a year, and we will call her Rebecca. Rebecca had previously lost her mom a little over a year prior to catching up with her. She had still been living in the house that she lived in with her mom. After her mother passed, Rebecca moved her bedroom into her mother's old bedroom, and this was the room we were hanging out in. Her and I were sitting on the floor talking. The door was wide open in my mid-right peripheral. Rebecca and I were talking about bad habits that she had formed, and I was giving her advice on how to stop these bad habits. During that conversation, I suddenly saw her mother clear as day in the doorway, smiling at me. She looked much younger and was wearing a pink shirt. Her energy was light, happy, and forgiving. But regardless of that, she still absolutely made the hair on my neck stand up, and my heart drop. Typically, I see spirits at the edge of my peripherals, whereas in this situation, she was more in my frontal view. I instantly put my hand up to my face to cover my view of the door. Rebecca didn't notice anything and continued to talk, and after about 10 minutes or so, I got the courage to put my hand back down, and her mother was, of course, no longer there. I never did tell Rebecca about this in fear that she wouldn't believe me, or even worse, get upset about it. I feel as though her mom watches over Rebecca, and she was maybe happy to see us together again, or maybe that I was giving her this advice to get over her bad habits. One can only wonder. This has got to be one of the most significant experiences that I've had, and I've never seen a spirit so clear as day, let alone someone that I recognized. Another story that comes to my mind is this. One day when I was 17 or so, I was lying in bed watching a movie with my father. He had left to go have a smoke, and I was alone with my dog who was lying at the end of my bed on the left. I was eating away at my Cheerios, looking at the paused movie screen. I then started to get that feeling like I was being watched by someone, and in my peripherals, I saw a gray figure standing in the doorway, which was on my left. I ignored it and continued to eat my Cheerios. I always figure it's just my eyes playing tricks on me, and I then noticed that the figure had disappeared. Not long after that, right in front of my eyes, the figure walked along the end of the bed, holding its arm above my sleeping dog, almost as if it was petting him. My dog reacted to it, waking up and lifting his head, looking right at it. It then faded away. This scared me, and I ran into the bathroom that was on the right and closed the door, spilling my Cheerios on the way, unfortunately. I stayed in the bathroom and called for my dad to come back. Once my dad came back, I was nervous to tell him about it, so I decided not to, and we started the movie back up. I have a very strong feeling that this spirit was my grandpa who had passed away when I was 12, and my dog was once his, and I feel like he was visiting me and saying hi to his dog. The spirit's presence felt familiar and didn't scare me. It was the fact that I saw it right in front of my eyes, and that my dog also reacted to it as well, further validating that the spirit was there. That is all that I have for today. Thank you in advance if you do read my stories. I love the podcast and I listen to it almost every day. There is so much out there that we will never fully understand, and I feel as though we don't even have the vocabulary to articulate it. Maybe it's for the best that we don't know. All the best, Melanie. Our next story comes to us from Fiona, and Fiona's story is called Dreams in the Witch House. Fiona says, "Hi. I don't really know how to start this off, since there are several experiences that I wish to share with you. I will start with my background. I live in New England, in a small town, in an old house. My house is approximately 200 years old, and before my parents moved in, an Italian family lived there, and I believed that they were the only people who had lived in the house before us. When my parents moved in, they found some really odd stuff. In the basement, which was unfinished with rock walls and a dirt floor, they found nightshade growing, which, if it was naturally growing there, is weird in and of itself, because why wouldn't the prior family remove it? But nightshade, although poisonous, can be used as a hallucinogen when taking the right amount. They also found scrolls of paper in the attic, tied with twine. When untied, they found ashes inside. This led my parents to believe that one of the family members was practicing witchcraft. Recently, I was in the basement and found a rectangle of wood nailed to the rafters, with carvings which appeared to be kind of circular. Some look like moons, but some kind of look like boats, and another one of the carvings looked like a gallows. There was also a feather tied to it. Also, I wasn't there to confirm whether or not the scrolls of paper were the result of witchcraft, but I have to say that the carved wood did look like the result of witchcraft. My only credentials are that I am pagan, but I am no witchcraft expert. People have died in the household as well. One of the daughters of the previous family had died in the house. She is buried in the graveyard across the street, and we have a framed picture of her, so I would not be surprised if her presence still remains within my home. I had an older brother who died in an accident in his bedroom, and this was before I was born, so I have never met him. My mother told me, though, that when he was little, he said that there was a dead boy buried in our backyard. Whether that is true or not is still creepy. When I was about 7 or 8, I was downstairs by myself watching television, and the couch was facing the TV, of course, but there's a doorway in the wall that the TV is on, and the lights were off in that room. I could see into that room, but only from the light that was on in the living room. I saw a woman in white, wearing a bonnet, with a baby crawling at her feet. Of course, as a 7-year-old, that scared the crap out of me, and I pulled the blanket over my face. That's really the only ghost sighting that I've had in the house, but a lot of the time, I do feel like I'm being watched. Sometimes it's a comforting presence, or something that I'm used to, but sometimes it does feel sinister. On several occasions, I've been in other houses and would think I saw something move quickly behind a corner or a doorway, which is probably more due to paranoia than the paranormal. But considering the things I have positively experienced, it wouldn't be surprising. The reason that the subject of this email is called Dreams in the Witch House is because I have had what I believe to be prophetic dreams that I have had within this literal witch house, and this first dream is pretty insignificant, but I still think it's weird. I was planning on making some dessert that required fruit, something like plums or peaches, I can't really remember. I had asked my dad to go out and get the plums, and he said that he would the next day. That night, I dreamt that he had gone to the store and got strawberries instead of plums. He had come home and told me that they were out of plums, so he got strawberries instead. I said nothing of it to my family because it was just a dream about plums. But the next day, he was going to get plums, and he had texted me that they were out. It was really odd, and not really that important, but the fact that I predicted it still weirded me out. This next dream is a bit more worrying. It was a month or two before the news of COVID-19. I had a dream where I was watching a news broadcast, and they were reporting on a war, including bombing. The people on the TV were talking, and then people started screaming. The cameraman then ran to the windows, and people were panicking and driving out of the city where the broadcast was taking place. A bomb was about to drop. The reporters and cameraman ran to the roof to get on a helicopter, and they were yelling about the incoming apocalypse. One of the reporters jumped off the side of the building, committing suicide, and that was the end of the dream. I have never had any apocalyptic dreams before, and this is probably a stretch, but after that dream, with the premise of tragedy, death, and fighting, the COVID news broke out, and the riots started happening. It may be coincidental, but I believe it to be something more. Thank you for listening to my stories. It just feels good to be able to discuss the paranormal without feeling judged. I love your podcast, and the fact that you have a platform that allows small-town people like myself to get their stories out. Our next story of the night comes to us from Cherokee, and Cherokee's story is called Earthquake of My Dreams. Cherokee says, "Hey Nick, as you can probably tell by my first name, and yes, it is my real name, I was raised in a native household where the paranormal was considered par for the course. The other half of my DNA is Celtic, so you might say that my family members all got a double whammy of weird happenings. My grandmother, father, sisters, and brother have all been spirit talkers and dreamers. This made for an interesting childhood, to say the least. My most prominent gift has always been prophetic dreams and premonitions. Having said this, I'll try to describe what happened in January of 1994. My husband Charlie and our 2 small daughters had recently returned to California from Colorado, where we had been the victims of a real estate scam. To be specific, we moved into a very small apartment in Northridge, a town I knew well, as I had been born in the original Northridge Hospital in 1956, and had spent most of my childhood in or around that area. Anyway, around the 8th or so of January, I began to feel as though something huge was going to happen, although I wasn't, at least consciously, sure what. I do remember saying to my husband, half joking, "Feels like we're gonna get one hell of a quake any minute now." And 2 nights later, I had the most vivid and accurate dream I've ever had. In my dream, my husband and I had been scoping out our neighborhood for a larger apartment, as the one we had was cramped in the extreme for 2 adults and 2 small children. We had found one that we liked and submitted a rental app to the manager. This apartment was only up the street and around the corner from our present place. Upon waking up the next morning, Charlie and I walked around the corner and submitted our app, as we had in the dream. That night, I was dreaming about us in our present residence. I dreamt that the entire building began to bounce up and down, as though it were being attached to a monster jackhammer. The refrigerator in the kitchen flew from where it had been standing to slam into the wall of our living room, next to the front door. I heard glass breaking, our kids screaming, and felt the floor sink beneath us. At the time, this apartment was on the 2nd floor. In the hallway, there was the banging of closets and pantry doors, and both my husband and I, along with our material possessions, were being thrown about the room. As the shaking finally abated, we were able to rescue our daughters from their bedroom, which was sinking into the parking area outside. It was a miracle that none of us had been hurt or killed, and the apartment itself was slowly collapsing into itself. We all walked out of the rubble and immediately took up residence in the other apartment around the corner, which, in the weird way that sometimes happens during earthquakes, wasn't touched. And that was the dream. On January 17th, 1994, it all happened, down to the smallest detail. My family and I were allowed to immediately move into our new apartment, and aside from having to do without some basic items, such as beds and other furniture, etc., we all came through it without a scratch. There was only one tiny difference from the real version, which was that my grandmother came by to see what she could do to help us, as I tried to salvage and move anything usable from the old place. But she had been dead for nearly 10 years. Thanks, Nick, and we'll talk again later. Take care. Our next story of the night comes to us from River, and River's story is called I'm No Stranger to the Paranormal. River says, "Hi Nick, I recently found your podcast on Spotify, and it is my go-to listening for work these days. As the subject states, I'm no stranger to the paranormal. It is easier to tell you what I haven't experienced than to list the things I have. Those things would be sleep paralysis, UFOs, and cryptids. I've had plenty of brushes with most other types of the paranormal, but the story I'm about to share is weird, even from my own experiences. This wasn't like a glitch in the Matrix. It was more like I phased out of sync with the timeline or universe, which sometimes I do, so I'll preface my encounter with a story about that. I used to be a member of a Wiccan church. This is an important detail because, like myself, the paranormal was normal to them. One Halloween, we had finished our ritual and divination, and half a dozen of us or so had gone inside to just chat. We were in the kitchen at the table, and I was sitting in the seat where I always sat. I got still and quiet, just listening to the conversations going on around me, content to be in the company of friends. Then, one of the men in the group looked across the kitchen and said, "Where's River?" All of the people around the table, including the lady right next to me, literally 6 inches away, were looking around the kitchen for me. One of them asked if maybe I had gone to the bathroom, and the gal beside me said that she hadn't seen me get up. This went on for a full minute. People I'd known for 2 years who'd become like family couldn't find me and could not see me, though I was sitting right there with them. I looked at the man of the group who noticed my absence and then moved just slightly. He was visibly shaken to watch me return. In his words, I materialized out of thin air. The people around the table must have seen something similar. They all responded with exclamations of their own. For the rest of the night, everyone wanted to know how I did it. Anyway, here's my experience that happened a year or two after the first one, but it was around the same time of year. I had just moved to a new town and was in my first apartment with my partner at the time. We sublet the apartment from some friends who moved farther south. I worked an early shift in healthcare, and my partner worked a later shift in media. The way the apartment was set up, the door opened into the living room/dining room, and from the kitchen, I could see who was coming in. I always left the door unlocked for my partner because we lived in a neighborhood where you could do that. One evening, I was cooking, and out of the corner of my eye, the door opened. I thought that I had let time get away from me and my partner was home. Speeding time up is also a problem I have. As I turned to greet him, my hello stopped mid-sentence. It wasn't him. It was a dark-haired man in army fatigues with a couple of what looked to me to be grocery bags. He was a bit hazy, almost out of phase. I could see that my door had never been opened. He was as surprised to see me and hear me as I was to see him, and he dropped his bags on the floor. We stared at each other with mouths open for only a second or two. It was evident that he had seen me as well. He then faded out, gently away. I am fairly certain one of two things happened. Either a small portal opened between our universe and whatever universe lies on top of ours, or I phased out of sync with this universe and ended up catching a glimpse of that universe. Either way, it was one of the weirdest experiences I've had, and I have both a poltergeist story, and I have witnessed a portal open and release entities onto this plane. If any of your listeners have experienced something similar or have questions, feel free to send them my way. I'm always open to hear what others think. River. As we bring tonight's episode to an end, I'd like to thank all of you for tuning in, and a special thank you goes out to Meg, Melanie, Fiona, Cherokee, and River for sharing their experiences. Have you witnessed the unexplained? If so, I'd like to hear your story. You can reach me by emailing your experience to paranormalmysteriespodcast@gmail.com or by visiting our website at paranormalmysteriespodcast.com. You can find all of our contact information in the show notes. Until next time, I hope you all have a great beginning to your week, and I look forward to seeing you back here on Wednesday as we continue our search for answers here on Paranormal Mysteries.